Hello. We're going to start our program. I really want to welcome you all, and Bill Johnson, the head of our board, is here. This couldn't happen without the board helping to support us and having you all come and be a member of the Institute. We are really lucky and very fortunate to have a wonderful speaker today. Peter is a man I call of all seasons. He's the senior editor of the Sunday Times of London, New York correspondent to the Times, a columnist of the Observer. He's written many things for the New York Times, the Spectator, and the Miami Herald, and he also presented television shows. The book he is going to be talking about today, he has just informed me, he has won 3 literary awards. This book is The French Mind. It's a dazzling history of France that takes us from the 17th century to the present day through the nation's most influential thinkers. This is a history that documents the shaping of a nation whose global influence in art, culture, and politics cannot be overstated. And I must say it's dear to me because they also got involved in law and became one of the most important international law firms. And that's what I was married into it. So I'd like to introduce Peter and have him talk about his book.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Dale, thank you for those words. What I'm going to try and do in the next 30 or 40 minutes, 4 things. I'm going to try and describe how the French, how their mind and their behavior differs from anybody else's, and show that I'm not the only one who thinks so. I'm then briefly going to describe how the French describe themselves as different, which I don't find entirely convincing. And then I'm going to give you a bit more length, my theories, which you'll see fall into 2. So that's 4 things in all. I also want to begin by saying that it's quite apropos to make these remarks in America, because if you ever study any history, you will find that many historians think that there are, out of the 197 countries that belong to the United Nations, only 2 are truly exceptional. And those 2 are France and America. And a man, Richard Cusell, who is a professor at Washington University, wrote 2 very good books about the relationship between France and America. And he made this generalization, which in his book he put in italics: France, the Americans and the French are the only 2 people who think that the rest of the world wants to be like them. He said the Americans think they have the secret of liberty and prosperity, and nobody can doubt that, I don't think. And the French think that they have... Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay, is that better? Yeah. And the French think that they have their mission civilisatrice, that they are the most civilized people in the world. Well, what do other people think? He thinks that the arrogance of both he thinks that both Americans and the French are arrogant about themselves, and that therefore this creates a mutual antipathy. And I'll be coming back to that. To show that what other people think, as well as me, I'll give you the titles of some recent books. 60 Million Frenchmen Can't Be Wrong. Subtitle, Why We Love France, But Not the French. French women don't get fat. French women don't get facelifts. French children don't throw food. French parents don't give in. 1,000 years of annoying the French. That was a British author. These books explore a colourful landscape of characteristics. They're hardly academic, but I think they do hit home from time to time. These titles are admiring of the French, but also irritated by what is often seen as their arrogance. Here are some observations from these books which will show what I'm going to be talking about. Love of grandeur is one of the fundamental characteristics of French culture. They have an innate disposition towards creative thinking. The seductive power of intellectual foreplay, that's one of my favorites. They have a degree of self-assurance that few other countries have. The dedicated quest for the gastronomic orgasm, another favorite. The French refuse to utter the words, "I don't know." In France, there is a residual belief in the intrinsic genius or superiority of the French language. Not a week goes by in France without talk of l'exception culturelle. These observations are meant seriously, but they're not really followed through. I mean, how do you calibrate love of grandeur? But now consider the work of a man who may be known to you or not, Sudhir Hazaraziz Singh. He's an Oxford academic who grew up in Mauritius, and he now has a flat in Paris. And a couple of years ago, he wrote a book called How the French Think, with a subtitle, An Affectionate Portrait of an Intellectual People. Amongst his observations, in a very interesting book, are as follows. They have an unrelenting dogmatism. They have a magnificent rhetorical style in conversation. The activities of the mind have occupied a special place in French public life. The French are typically a reflective people whose attachment to the realm of ideas is both intense and demonstrative. The philosophical spirit is more developed in France than anywhere else in the world. In France, we have no oil, but we have ideas. France believes it is a beacon to the rest of the world, with an uncritical belief in the supremacy of the French mission civilisatrice. There is also a preference for abstract argument over concrete, evidence-based discussion. All the great ideals of European civilization have come from France. French unhappiness may be caused by too much thinking. Intellectuals continue to matter more in France than anywhere else. It's a lot to take in, and some of these observations are paradoxical and contradictory. Others are dated, not all are flattering. But the point is, it's France that attracts these bold, provocative statements. There are no books on why American women don't get facelifts, how the Italians think, or 1,000 years of annoying the British, though that may change with Brexit, I think. Anyway, I think that he's onto something, as are some of those other books, and I will be trying to explain why. Before that, however, let's briefly explain why the French think they're so different. A French philosopher called François Furet used to teach in Chicago every autumn until he died having a fall on the tennis court. But his argument is that France, the French rather, more than anyone else, compare themselves with people they think they're second fiddle to. And in this, the most important point in history for what I'm talking about today is 1763, which is the end of the 7 Years' War, fought between Britain and France. Britain defeated France right across the world in the years leading up to that. 7 Years' War is sometimes called the First World War. Britain won in Canada, it won here in Florida, it won in the West Indies, in West Africa, and in India. And from then on, the world spoke English rather than French. And since then, it was an important point in French history because until 1763, France was the top dog. She was richer, bigger, more creative than anybody else. From 1763 until 1870, the siege of Paris and the Franco-Prussian War, the French compared themselves with Britain. From the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71 until the First World War, France compared itself with Germany. And since then, it has compared itself with America. Now, a lot of non-French people, and I'm just going to show you how, a lot of non-French people don't know that there is a thriving anti-American literature in France. Here are some of the titles. America the Menace, Scenes from the Life of the Future. Menace in the West, The Rise of French Anti-Americanism. L'Amérique est-elle trop riche? America, is she too rich? Les Américains sont-ils adultes? Americans, are they adult? I mean, how insulting is that? But I understand why these books haven't been translated into English. The height of this literature was the postmodern philosopher Jean Baudrillard, and I'll quote some quotes from his Amérique, published in 1986. He quotes, "He claimed to find a chasm of modernity between France and the United States, because America, as he put it, represents the end of European values and culture. It is a society without reflection or introspection, without depth or a sense of the tragic. America was already in decline, he thought, at the facelift stage, as he put it." Facelifts again. Turning to my explanation, my friends always say, don't put too many dates in your talks. But I'm going to give you some dates. You don't have to remember them, just to show you that there's something happening all very close together. And I go back now to the last half of the 17th century. This was the great age of French classicism, the age of Poussin, the Lenain brothers, other great, Lebrun and other great painters, Molière, Racine, and Corneille in drama, Mansart and Le Notre in architecture. Now come the dates, and listen to the mix. 1648, foundation of the Academy of Painting and Sculpture. 1651, publication of the first book to use the phrase haute cuisine. 1659, the first use of the phrase haute coiffure. Mid-1660s, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the chief minister, sends spies to Venice to steal the secret of mirror making. It's a very violent thing, but they do. They find out the secret. At that stage, mirrors were only about 2 feet long. The French developed them to be full length. And of course, the invention of the full length mirror was transformative in fashion. People could see themselves dressed in clothes for the first time clearly, and this really boosted the fashion industry. 1667, I like this one. 2,700 glass lanterns are installed through the 912 streets of central Paris, the birth of nightlife. Paris was the first city to have nightlife and entertainment. And if you read in French schools now, the letters of Madame de Sévigné are taught as the most perfect form of French. And if you read her letters to her daughter who lived in the south of France, she's always going on about the pleasures of going through Paris late at night, helping people get home because it's all lit. And she too talks for 1 minute about the paintings that she's seen, but all the new fashions, the hair fashions and the shoe fashions and so forth. 1669, a date you will all know, Dom Perignon invents champagne, which immediately becomes more than a wine but a celebration. 1671, the Royal Academy of Architecture is founded. 1672, a year later, La Mercure de France is founded. This is a fashion newspaper edited by Dominique de Visé, who the next year declares the first opening of the first fashion season, and he calls it the year of the shoe. Year later, same year, 1672, the Royal Academy of Music is founded. 1675, the first café, the Café Procope, is opened in Paris. 1680, the Comédie Française is given its monopoly on dramatic art. Now, the point should be clear. You've got both, on the one hand, high culture, all the academies of high culture being formed, and on the other hand, you've got fashion, food, wine, all becoming the center of attention and developing alongside the high culture. Into this mix are two more factors. In the mid-1660s, Louis XIV, the Sun King, moves his court from Paris to Versailles, which is then about 2 or 3 hours away by horse from central Paris. That's one thing. The second thing is a number of women find his court boorish, coarse, and misogynistic. And they leave the court, and they go back to Paris, and they start up their own courts. At first, these were called circles, and eventually the world settled down to they're called salons. And that's really what my book is about. These women who, by definition, all had the gift of friendship. The fashion developed for a salon to be held the same day, the same time, once a week. And the women would invite, they would first of all provide excellent food and wine, and they would invite the people of the town, who were not only the socialites, but the intellectual people as well, the philosophers, the playwrights, the painters, the poets. And this begins a tradition in France of the salon culture, and in my view is why it starts to be this amalgam in France, unlike anywhere else, where high culture is more widely accepted amongst everybody. Everybody tends to be better read, but it's mixed in with high fashion, high hairdos. There's one photograph in my book about a woman with her hair is shaped around a galleon. I mean, so, she couldn't get through any door. It's just amazing. The fashion was just amazing. So I'm going to just, how do I get this out? Brute force, I see here. So I'm just going to talk you through some of, there were hundreds of salons in France. I concentrate on 30 or 40 in my book, but I'm just going to talk you through a handful here to show you. I actually start with someone who's not in the book, Madame du Deffand. Most of you will have heard of the highlight of the French Enlightenment was the Encyclopédie, the Encyclopedia, which was edited by Diderot and Jean d'Alembert and had contributions from people like Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Buffon, the great botanist. Well, all these people went to Madame du Deffand's salon, and she bankrolled the encyclopedia. She paid Diderot and d'Alembert money to pay people like Rousseau to write. Rousseau wrote mainly about music in the encyclopedia, but Voltaire wrote about everything, scurrilous stuff. And she was really the power behind the throne. It's not generally known it was a woman who paid for all this. This is Germaine de Stael, who was actually, I apologize for these being so small, but it was the best I could do in the short moment. Germaine de Stael was actually Swiss, French-speaking Swiss. Her father was a big banker in the shenanigans and the financial problems that led up to the French Revolution. She married the Swedish ambassador, and she's pictured here as Corinne. She wrote a number of steamy novels about women in a man's world, and they were salacious and very successful. But she had Diderot and D'Alembert in her salon. She actually inherited her salon from her mother and bequeathed hers to her daughter, though neither her mother or her daughter were as distinguished as she was. Amongst her friends, she had an affair with Talleyrand and with Benjamin Constant. Talleyrand was foreign minister from before the revolution to after the revolution. Benjamin Constant was known for his liberal politics, and he's one of the founders of liberalism, which means different things, I know, in different places. But it did begin with Constant in France. Condorcet, the great philosopher, was also a member of her salon. He was an early advocate of female rights, and so was Buffon, a member of her salon. Very, very broad thing. She fancied an affair with Napoleon. Napoleon thought she was repulsive, so she got her own back by inviting his family to her salon. He was livid. Juliette Recamier, this picture, if you can see it, shows not only how beautiful she was, but how seductive. She was a great friend of de Staël's, and Napoleon really fancied her and offered her 3 jobs, all of which she turned down. She was famous in her salon for her shawl dance. She did a kind of dance of the 7 veils, and she sometimes held her salon in bed, in her underclothes. But people flocked around her bed, the men standing on chairs to see her, and so on. But the 2 main people from her salon were Alexis de Tocqueville, who escaped the revolution, came here to America. Some of us, you know, wrote a very famous book called Democracy in America, which he thought was a very good idea in revolutionary France. And in particular, in that book, he was very impressed by the American jury. And he said everybody should be on a jury, not because it's a good way to decide who is guilty and who is not, but it introduces people to the way the state works. It introduces them to decision-making in literally life or death situations. It's very good for the intellectual life all round. And his book did very, very well. The other man was René Chateaubriand, after whom the steak is named. And Chateaubriand was a French Byron. He was dashingly good-looking, waves of wavy hair, and he wrote 2 very good books. One was about memories from beyond the grave, which was enabled him to pretend that he was dead and say some very unpleasant things about some people he knew. And the other one, because Christianity had taken such a blow in the French Revolution with Robespierre's cult of the supreme being and so on, he wrote a book called The Genius of Christianity, which is beautifully written, and made Christianity very, very popular, and also sparked in France the Romantic movement, which was emerged later there than in Germany or in Britain. Moving on, Delphine de Girardin, born Delphine Gray, and what you can see here is she's very precious, very cute. She was a poet, and she would write poems about the opening of a railway station or somebody had got some honor. And she was acknowledged by the emperor, who gave her a pension. And she then met Émile de Girardin, who founded the cheap press in France. So they became what we would call the power couple. And their salon was huge and utterly glittering. And I'll read you some of the names so I don't forget any. Victor Hugo was one of the great stars. Balzac, George Sand, Alexandre Dumas, the painter Delacroix, de Nerval, the mystic writer, Meyerbeer, the composer, Rossini, the composer, Chopin, the composer, Stendhal. I mean, imagine being in one room with all those individuals. If you have hair, curl it, I think. My Mary Dagu, my favorite, she was determined in her career to show that there's more to woman, being a woman, than motherhood. She was a half German, and she was born on the stroke of midnight, which in Germany makes you a midnight child, and you're supposed to have a very dark life. Well, she had her ups and downs. She married a man in an arranged marriage and became very quickly bored with it, so started her own salon. Before she started her salon, she was in another salon where she was asked to play the piano. She was a very good pianist, almost concert level. And she played the piano, and she played a piece by Rossini. And it was a large salon, and she didn't know that Rossini was in the audience. And after she'd finished, he came up to her and he said, "Madam, that's the best rendering of my piece I've ever heard." Now, whether or not he was flattering her or it was the truth, who can say? It was a nice thing to say. And she started her own salon and invited him. And because she was so musical, a lot of her people were composers. And she invited Chopin, and then she invited Franz Liszt. And Franz Liszt and she fell head over heels in love. So much in love that they eloped to Geneva. And this, of course, was a total scandal in Paris. They not only eloped, they had a couple of children. And they stayed in Geneva for a while, and she started writing anti-Geneva articles as it happened. So they were never very popular. But he was constantly on tours and coming back. And eventually somebody said to her, this is one of the little-known facts of French history, "You know, why don't you come back? After all, Delacroix, who goes everywhere, is the illegitimate son of Talleyrand. So if he can get away with it, why can't you?" So they go back to Paris, and she resumes her salon, and just to make sure I haven't left anybody out. Yes, she knew two people in her salon. There was a man called Hummel, who was the teacher of Mozart, and George Herwegh, who was a very, very close colleague of Karl Marx and had to be in exile from Germany. So it was a very interesting salon. She formed a firm friendship with George Sand, and they used to go and stay with each other. And there was a symmetry to their relationship because Marie was with Liszt, and of course George Sand was then having an affair with Chopin. So there was a symmetry there. And because of the symmetry, Marie told George Sand about the internal relationship with Liszt. George Sand rather sanctimoniously said, "Well, I can't write a book about this because you're my friend." But her other friend, she told all the details to Balzac, who then put them in a very steamy novel. And Marie and George Sand fell out quite heavily. Anyway, she did write a very good book on the history of the French Revolution of 1848. People always talk about the French Revolution. There have been at least 3, and I think it's important to know that. And it's still worth reading, her book about, she knew all the main players. It's very, very good, very, very good. Now, here, yes, this one here. This is Apollonie Sabatier. Very, very beautiful. And her friends, in her thing, her main lover was Baudelaire. Baudelaire sent her, he courted her anonymously by sending her poems. And eventually she found out, because those poems became something you will have heard of, Les Fleurs de Mal, Baudelaire's great contribution. And she is the main figure in this. Now, she was very beautiful, and she had, there were people like Théophile Gautier, Meissonier, Flaubert, all there. But the reason they went is that she allowed them to talk dirty. If you read Gautier's letters to Apollonie, they're filthy. They're absolute. I mean, you go red, even though you're on your own reading them. They're just embarrassing. But she didn't mind, and all these high-flown people went along there. And I have this one anecdote in the book where Gautier became a very well-known and stylish travel writer. And on one of these things, he went to Russia. And he traveled back from Russia. And you can imagine then, it'd been 2 or 3 days on the train. He arrived in Paris, and he knew that the salon was meeting that night. So he goes straight from the railway station to the salon without changing out of his traveling clothes, which conveys some of the idea of how exciting people found the salons as a form of civilization. Here we have Genevieve Halevi and Laura de Sade. Laura de Sade was, like Recamier, regarded as the most beautiful woman in Paris at the time. She was a direct descendant of the Marquis de Sade, returning to filth. And she had an affair with Maupassant, and all the Impressionist painters, Degas and so on, were in her salon. But the interest of these two is that they are the prototypes for Madame de Verdurin, who is the salonière in Proust's great book. So I'm sure some of you have read some of Proust. If you've read all of Proust, put your hand up. Anyway, and then coming to the end of this, if you can see here, the Princess de Polignac, she was actually American, Winnaretta Singer, the daughter of the man who created the Singer sewing machine company. And he had several wives, quite a lot of mistresses, and sired over 20 children. He, with one of his wives, he married a French woman, and he found that he preferred Europe to America. So he bought a house in Paris and a country house on the Cornish coast in Britain, where they would spend some of their summers. Now, she was a wonderful musician, and her salon was probably the only one to rival the one I mentioned earlier. Let me read some of the names at Winnaretta Singer's salon. Debussy, Gabriel Fauré, Serge Lifar, Proust, Stravinsky, Schoenberg, Sir Thomas Beecham, Ravel, Eric Satie, Cole Porter, Jean Lanvin, Elsa Maxwell, Violet Trefusis, Edith Wharton. Again, imagine being in a room with all of these people, what the conversation must have been like. Jean Cocteau was also a member. And her pièce de résistance was she was the head of the consortium that sponsored the Ballet Russe and brought Diaghilev and Nijinsky to Paris. Absolutely fabulous woman. Changing subject, if you can see it down the bottom here, Paulette Nadal, born in Martinique. She and her sister were the first black students at the Sorbonne. And she had a salon between the wars where she introduced a lot of the Harlem Renaissance Americans and the Jazz Age Americans to French society. And in particular, Leopold Senghor from West Africa and Aimé Césaire, also from Martinique, who between them conceived the idea that you may have heard of, negritude, which is the idea that there is something specific about black people that produces a distinctive culture. And in those days, the West Indians and the West Africans looked down on African Americans because they thought that African Americans were too much in thrall to white society to produce anything new, and that more interesting things would come out of the West Indies and West Africa. I don't have a picture of one of the great collaborationist salons in Paris. There were 4 of them, unhappily. And the greatest was Florence Gould, who was born in San Francisco to French parents and then married John Jay Gould, who was in railways, and she had a salon in Paris during the occupation. And one of the main guests was Ernst Junger, who wrote a very good book about the First World War called Storm of Steel, but then, believe it or not, was working in Paris on the Operation Sea Lion, which are the plans for the invasion of Britain. And she was very happy for him to do that. Also Helmut Nocken, who was in charge of he destroyed 8 synagogues in Paris. So she was not that much on our side, though Matisse was there, Céline, the author, was there, Marie Laurencin went there because the food was so good, and Sacha Guitry. Now, Sacha Guitry had a mixed press, you would say, but a British mathematician found out some documents only about 8 years ago in Britain that showed that Sacha Guitry had gone to Britain in August 1939, just before war broke out, and delivered to the British Secret Service an Enigma machine, which the Polish had captured from the Germans. And of course, the rest is history, so to speak. Without that, Britain might have lost the war. So we owe a lot, in the end, to Sacha Guitry, and maybe to Florence Gould. Right at the bottom, the last one, the death of the salons has been continually predicted, but the latest I found was Edmée de la Rochefoucauld, who died in 1991. And her salon is Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Raymond Aron, Pierre Nora, the great historian. And he's coming here shortly, Hugo Vickers, the biographer of Cecil Beaton. He actually attended her salon. It was in the Place des États-Unis in Paris. And he said it was notable for its cucumber sandwiches. So that's the salons. The second part of my argument, again, comes from French. Am I okay here? You can hear? Yes. Going back to 1763, and the change in the nature of history in France. The remarkable fact is, as several historians have pointed out, since 1763, France has suffered an endless array of military defeats. Almost every generation. Some of them, 1815, 1870, 1940, were not just defeats, they were humiliations. And I think this has had an important effect on French psychology, because I don't know about you, but I feel my defeats much more keenly than I enjoy what successes come my way. And I think that's true in general from talking to other people. And I think it's this history of successive defeats, what Michael Certeau called the repeated wound, and what another historian called the unique culture of defeat of France, has had a marked effect on its thinking. But it's not all bad news, because France has also come back very quickly from its defeats. After Waterloo, you get the emergence of Romantic literature in France. After the 1848 revolution, you get the efflorescence of Impressionism in France. After 1870-71, when the Parisians are besieged and reduced to eating the animals in the zoo, by 1885, less than a generation later, what is the capital of the world? It's not Vienna, it's not Berlin, it's not Philadelphia, it's not London, it's Paris. It's the Belle Époque. After Verdun, which was technically a victory, but as Churchill said, felt like a defeat, because France lost far more than any other of the combatant nations. By 1925, you have in Paris les années folles, the crazy years, and there are 10,000 foreign artists living in Paris. So Paris has this ability to come back. And why does it have the ability to come back? The salons. The salons, the saloniers, by definition, had the gift of friendship. They were used to introducing people like, literary writers who expected to be the big animal in the room, but they found there was other animals equally big. And they were used to bringing all this together. And in the late 19th century, specifically, politics in France, in the wake of the various revolutions, was as divided as politics in America are now. And the politicians who couldn't speak to each other or could hardly bring themselves to speak to each other in the National Assembly were introduced to each other in the salons. And the women had this amazing ability to bring everybody together. And this, in my view, accounts for why France, after its defeats, it comes back, but not in military affairs. It's either in painting or writing or fashion or whatever. And this, I think, again, helps to explain how the French have been what they are. I think I'm almost there. Yes. I'm going to end on a little vignette, which I find enchanting. And when you research books, the people who are also authors here will know you pick up all sorts of bits of information that don't really fit in. And this doesn't really fit in, and it's a long time ago, set in the early 18th century in France, and a long way away in Paris. But I think, you see, there's something a little bit Palm Beach about it. And it concerns a man called Bernard Fontenelle, who was a philosopher and a poet, though everybody was a poet in those days. And he wrote a book imagining if there could be life on other planets. Now, that's not controversial now, but it was controversial then because there's supposed to be only two places where there was life, Earth and heaven. And he also explained it by imagining a man and a woman in a moonlit garden, and the man is explaining the stars to the woman. The involvement of a woman was quite daring for its time. But that does show that he was a ladies' man. And Fontenelle was a bit like the late Duke of Edinburgh. He was first of all a ladies' man, but like the late Duke, he lived to a really ripe old age, and he died just a few weeks short of his 100th birthday. And he was just a few weeks before then, he was at his favorite salon, Sceaux, which is a big house in the south of Paris now, and the salon was run by the wife of the illegitimate son of Louis XIV. And he finds himself sitting next to Madame Anne Helvetius. She was married to the Baron Helvetius, another philosopher. But that night, he's sitting next to her, and she was then, like some of these I pointed out, she was then regarded as the most beautiful woman in Paris. And she was in her mid to late 30s, and she was just ravishing. And he sat next to her, and at one point, he said to her, "Oh, you're so beautiful." And he picked up her hand, brushed his lips against it, and then, in a whisper that was obviously designed for everybody to hear, "You're so beautiful, if only I were 80 again." Thank you for listening. Sorry, yes. Yeah.
Why don't you talk about Gertrude's family?
I do. I just haven't talked about it here. Yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah. There were quite a few, beginning of the 20th century, there were 2 or 3 Americans who had salons, and 1 or 2 British, too, but I can't fit everything in. That what?
A feminine movement.
Well, I keep out, have I written a feminist history? It didn't work like that. A lot of them in the 17th and 18th century a lot of them who wrote books wrote them under men's names, because that was what was done in those days. But beginning with Germaine de Stael, she wrote under her own name, and then that tradition was broken.
Do you see any evidence of French intellectual life recovering from the damage done by Derrida and Foucault?
Sorry, I couldn't hear. Any evidence of what?
Do you see any evidence of French intellectual life recovering from the damage done by Foucault and Derrida?
I do go into that. Recovering. Well, of course, the French would say they don't need to recover. And I think Derrida and Foucault, you have to distinguish, I think. Derrida and Foucault were taken much more seriously here in America than, say, in Britain. And now, I would say that Derrida is largely ignored, but I think Foucault, particularly his books on prisons, is now accepted as the mainstream. There was an exchange in the New York Review of Books about a book by a woman whose name I've forgotten, which said that Paris was the headquarters of the world's intellectual movement, and that no book could be taken seriously unless it was translated into French. I don't know whether you know what the book I'm talking about. I forget the title. Of course, this was decried by a lot of people, but French intellectual arrogance takes a long time to die, I think, or is taking a long time to die. Sorry.
Given that the French started to create these organizations 100 or so years before they joined us in fighting the British in the American Revolution, and the Americans that they fought side by side with were quite guttural by comparison to what you describe. I mean, were there any afterthoughts on the part of the French that had been written about that you were aware of?
Well, I can answer that by one little incident. Remind me, who was the Madeleine Albright, in her memoirs, says that at one stage in the late 1990s, she was trying to get together some United Nations action, and the French refused to join. And she said to the French foreign minister then, "Come on, Hubert, why don't you join? After all, Lafayette joined us in the Civil War." And he said, Madeleine, you don't understand. He didn't come to help the Americans. He came to defeat the British. Some things don't change. Yes, sir. I will.
I wanted to ask you the two defeats, I suppose you can call it that, after. Oh, sorry. You mentioned the importance of defeat and rejuvenation. And I can think of at least two defeats after World War II, Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, of course, and then, more importantly, Algeria, followed by some other colonies. What was the internal response in France among the intellectuals? And is it still going on to some degree?
Yeah, I do go into that. And I would say that the response to that is postmodernism, which is the idea on the concentration, the value of a term I find very ugly, but used of the other. And so you get, after the defeats, the rather ignominious, as you correctly say, the ignominious defeats. You respond by, the French respond by postmodernism, which I think a lot of people don't agree with it, or its ideas and assumptions. It's certainly the most powerful form of French philosophy in the last 40 years. And it's still going stronger there than in Britain or in America, though, of course, it was very strong at Yale, as you know, for a while. Yes?
On behalf of the feminist women of the turn
Behind you.
On behalf of the feminist movement on the turn of the century, just wanted to, I don't have a question, but I loved your book and I can't wait to read it. Sounds great. But the turn of the century women, in Balzac's novel about Giraud, the department store liberated them the most because that was the first time they were allowed to be out of the house alone, unescorted, and other than going to church.
Yes, that's a correct observation. I do go into that in the book. In fact, I have a whole chapter on the way the department store changed life. It changed fashion. The women, there was a lot of talk about, to begin with, that the department store was basically a whorehouse. That was one view, that men used to go and they would cruise around looking for a woman they fancied. But it was also the case that, and they help me out, I mean, Balzac gives them a particular name, these women who work in department stores, that they had income, they had numbers, and it was a liberation, and it was at the same time enabled them to take part in the fashion that was happening then, and that it was at the great age then, as you will know, of the fashion magazine. And I talk about the fashion magazines and the crossover between high style and the women's movement. And of course, Degas painted 23 paintings of milliners' hats, milliners' shops. He was a rich man, he didn't need to work, but he was fascinated, as was, I mean, if you look at Impressionism, Manet, he loved silks and satins and furs. The French, I've forgotten her name, the American woman, Mary Cassatt, she the same. So yes, there was this overlap between the fashion, a bit of male misogyny, and you're right, the growth of the fashion magazine. And there was, you may have read 2 years ago, when Vogue Paris, the American owners closed Vogue Paris, the French press went mad. You can't do this. Paris is still the home of fashion. We are still the most creative in fashion. But I think it remains closed. I may be wrong about that.